Welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into tonight's journey through ancient landscapes, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss another quiet but curious exploration. Now, settle in, relax your shoulders, and let your imagination drift to a time before concrete. Before roads, when people gathered not in lines, but in circles. Have you ever wondered why so many ancient villages, from Europe to Africa, from the Middle East to the Americas, were shaped like rings? This is not just a question of architecture. It's a question of how humans thought, lived, and saw the world. Tonight, we'll unravel the silent logic behind these forgotten circles, and maybe, by the end, they won't seem so strange after all. Before modern cities carved their names across maps with neat grids and sharp lines, there were circles etched softly into the land, following a shape older than measurement itself. Across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas, archaeologists have found ancient villages laid out in rings, sometimes perfect circles, sometimes sprawling spirals, but again and again, the curve, the loop, the enclosure. And these were not the result of randomness or artistic whim. They were deliberate, structured, repeated. So why did so many ancient societies, separated by oceans and millennia, choose to build their homes in circles? To start, the circle wasn't just a shape, it was a solution, a way of organizing life that was both practical and deeply symbolic. In the earliest human settlements, survival depended on unity. Every member of the tribe had a role. The layout of a circular village reflected that interdependence. Homes were often positioned around a central space, sometimes a fire pit, a meeting ground, or a ritual area. This core was the village's heart. No house sat behind another. Every family faced the same center. Everyone saw everything. This design had immediate defensive advantages. In hostile environments, circular structures allowed villagers to monitor all directions at once. There were no blind spots. Strangers approaching would always be visible. Children could play in the middle under many watchful eyes. And when threats came, the circle could close. In southern Africa, for instance, the Anguni and Sotho-Tswana peoples built circular homesteads with kraals, central animal enclosures, at the core. Each hut, round itself, contributed to a larger ring. Similarly, the Neolithic peoples of Europe created circular ditched enclosures, sometimes surrounded by palisades or banks. These weren't just fences, they were statements, boundaries, and yet the circle itself wasn't about exclusion. It was about containment, harmony, a place where everything had its place. There's also the natural influence. Human beings, from the very beginning, have lived under the sun, the moon, and the stars, all moving in cycles. The year itself turns in a circle. Day becomes night, then day again. Early people observed how nature rarely favored the straight line. Rivers bend, trees grow in rings. Animal herds cluster in curves. The circular village mirrored the world around it. But there's more. In some cases, circles were built not only for function, but for memory. Oral cultures passed stories through generations, and the shape of the village became part of the story. Walking the circle was like reciting a shared truth: who belonged where, how the village flowed, what came first and what came last. The architecture held the history. Even in the far north, among the ancient Sami reindeer herders, temporary camps were set in rings, each family with its own space, each fire its own point of light. In Mesoamerica, certain early settlements were also arranged in circular patterns, though later civilizations like the Maya shifted toward more monumental grids. Still, the memory of the circle lingered in ritual spaces, plazas, temples, altars round. Like the sun, the circle also resisted hierarchy. Unlike a central palace or elevated tower, circular layouts distributed presence equally. No one lived at the front. Everyone faced the center. In that way, the circle was democratic before the word existed, and yet with time, circles began to fade. As societies grew, as trade increased and military priorities shifted, straight roads and rigid grids replaced the soft boundaries of the ring. But the circular villages never truly disappeared. Some survived into modern times, modified, repurposed, or buried beneath newer towns. And when archaeologists dig down today, what they often find first is not a ruin or a tool, but a pattern, a gentle curve in the soil, a post hole in a ring, the echo of a design that once brought people together, not only for safety or warmth, but for something older, a shared belief that life, like the village, works best when it moves in a circle. To fully understand why ancient people favored circles, we need to go beyond the visible structure and step into the invisible systems that shaped their everyday lives. A circular village wasn't just about defending from outside threats. It was about maintaining internal order, about remembering who you were, who others were, and where you belonged in the unspoken rhythm of a place that never stopped turning. For many early cultures, space itself was memory. In societies with no written language, no maps, and no property deeds, where you lived, your exact place in the ring was often more than just practical. It told a story. Each house had meaning. If your hut was to the left of the main fire pit, that might mean your family was one of the founders. If you lived near the eastern entrance, perhaps your role involved greeting travelers or monitoring the sunrise for seasonal rituals. The shape of the village taught people how to navigate both space and identity. You didn't need signs or addresses. Children grew up knowing, our place is here, their place is there. This wasn't about exclusion, it was about orientation. Belonging was not only emotional, it was spatial. If you walked a circle, you remembered. Anthropologists studying circular settlements in West Africa have noted how such layouts often reflect kinship structures. Brothers might build homes adjacent to each other, parents slightly behind, elders near the ceremonial center. So walking through a village wasn't just moving through buildings, it was like reading a family tree laid out in packed earth and straw. These physical circles supported mental circles. In oral societies, stories were circular too repetitive, rhythmic, built on return. Many ancient creation myths begin and end in the same place. The universe is born, destroyed, and reborn. Time is not a line, it's a loop. That worldview bled into every aspect of life, from rituals to architecture. To sleep in a circle, eat in a circle, and speak in a circle was to live in rhythm with the world. Some scholars believe this preference for circular living also reinforced memory through repetition, when every morning began by facing the same center, seeing the same people in the same positions. A kind of shared awareness developed. You didn't need to write anything down. Your life was embedded in a physical memory system that moved with you, around you, and through you. Interestingly, even conflict resolution often took place in literal circles. Disputes were settled by sitting in rings where no one stood higher than another, and all voices could be heard. The architecture shaped the process. The absence of corners meant fewer places to hide physically or emotionally. In some Native American traditions, the circle represents wholeness, the four directions, and the unity of creation. And although these concepts differ by region and culture, the core idea remains. Circles are complete. They don't need a beginning or an end. They just are. That sense of constancy gave ancient villagers something many of us still crave: stability. In a shifting world. This didn't mean the circular village was utopian. There were still tensions, hierarchies, exclusions. But the form of the circle offered a kind of psychological scaffolding, a way to contain the chaos of human life in something soft, familiar, and endlessly returnable. Even today, when we gather around campfires or sit in circles during conversations, or design theaters with audiences all facing inward, we're echoing something ancient, a buried instinct, a memory older than our cities, a feeling that we are safest not when we build, upward or outward, but when we gather around something we share. When we think of defense in ancient times, the image that comes to mind is often the towering stone wall, ramparts, moats, guard towers. But for countless early communities, long before cities, kings, and empires, the primary form of defense wasn't a wall at all. It was shape. Specifically, the circle. To the untrained eye, a ring-shaped village might seem more symbolic than strategic. But for those who lived in one, it was a quiet, constant form of vigilance. Every home, every footpath, every clearing was part of an invisible grid designed to reduce chaos, monitor movement, and give structure to survival. And perhaps most importantly, to give time to respond. Let's break it down. In a typical circular settlement, the houses formed a near continuous ring doorways facing inward toward a shared central space. This central clearing might contain a communal fire pit, a cooking area, grain stores, or a sacred object. What it almost never contained was privacy. That was the point. The middle of the circle was exposed, open, and visible from every dwelling. That meant anything or anyone that, entered that space was instantly under observation. Unlike a gridded street system or scattered rural huts, where an intruder could move unseen between buildings, a circular layout made such stealth nearly impossible. To approach the center, you had to cross open ground, and that ground was surrounded by watchful eyes. Even during sleep, the logic of the circle remained intact. In many ancient communities, fires were kept burning all night at the center of the ring, not just for warmth, but for visibility. Shadows cast by the flames danced on the curved interiors of each hut. Anyone stepping into the circle would interrupt that rhythm. Movement was noticed. Silence was broken. The system worked. It wasn't just about outsiders either. Circles also managed internal disorder. In communities without jails or professional enforcers, social pressure was the first and strongest line of defense. And nothing enforced behavior like constant visibility. When everyone can see everyone else's door, routines, and choices, deviation is no longer private. It becomes public performance. In modern terms, the circular village functioned like a panopticon, not because someone was always watching, but because you never knew if someone was. That ambiguity enforced order. It didn't eliminate conflict, but it contained it. If someone shouted, stole, or stormed across the central ground, the act echoed louder, not just acoustically, but socially. Let's also consider escape routes. In circular designs, exits were few and obvious. Often only one or two narrow paths led away from the ring. These weren't just practical, they were symbolic. In a place where the community's unity was physically reinforced by the ring, to step outside that form had weight. Children were told not to wander beyond the ring without an elder. Travelers were noticed the moment they broke the circle. And attackers? They had nowhere to hide during approach. Even the materials used for the outermost buildings were often chosen for their defensive properties. Thicker walls, heavier doors. In some cases, the outer side of the ring would be lined with brambles, thorns, or storage piles, not as barriers, but as buffers. Enough to slow someone down, enough to make noise, enough to alert. Now let's talk about fire, one of the most feared and respected forces in early human settlements. In a square or grid layout, fire could sweep through homes in sequence using straight lines to leap from roof to roof. But in a circle with houses slightly angled and separated by curvature, the path of destruction wasn't guaranteed. More importantly, with everyone facing the same central source of heat and light, any accidental blaze was instantly visible to all. Response could be immediate. This responsiveness was a key part of the circular defense logic. These weren't fortresses, they were living systems. You didn't rely on thick gates or tall towers. You relied on each other, on the closeness of voices, the way that footsteps sounded different when they broke from the norm, the way dogs growled differently when they saw someone who didn't belong. And let's not forget acoustics. In a circle, sounds carry. A cry for help at the center could reach every ear within seconds. Whispers from one home could pass easily to the next. Drums, chants, or warnings any communal signal had. A built-in amplification system, reinforced by design. Over time, these villages didn't just defend against physical threats. They shaped emotional safety too. Children grew up knowing that if they ran toward the middle, they were running toward help. Elders knew they could call out and be heard, and in times of mourning or celebration, the village could gather around. The center facing one another, not in rows, not in silence, but in shared focus. Compare that to modern neighborhoods, grids of square houses, fenced yards, high hedges, garage doors that open and close without ever needing to see a neighbor. Security now is cameras and locks. Back then, it was presence, community, attention. But perhaps the most powerful defense was psychological. To live in a circle was to know that your place had a place, that your roof was part of something larger, that there were no dead ends, only returns. You couldn't get lost in a ring. You couldn't vanish. Even in crisis, the shape brought you back. It's easy to underestimate this today, in a world shaped by individualism and property lines. But for ancient people, the circle wasn't primitive. It was elegant. It used geometry to create peace. It turned visibility into safety, and it made the simple fact of being seen, not just physically, but socially, emotionally, a protective force. So while circular villages lacked the dramatic visuals of later castles or citadels, they offered something arguably better: early warning, full awareness, and the strength of shared attention. And for centuries, that was enough. When you stepped into an ancient circular village, you didn't just enter a cluster of dwellings, you entered a memory. A living, breathing memory encoded in the very shape of the place. To the people who lived there, the layout wasn't simply convenient or traditional. It was identity. A map not just of where they lived, but who they were, what they believed, and how they saw the world. Imagine walking the gentle arc of such a village just before dusk. Smoke rises slowly from central hearths. Children's laughter loops in a spiral through the open center. Every doorway you pass isn't anonymous. It belongs to someone you know, perhaps your cousin, your midwife, your friend, since childhood. The paths between homes aren't roads, they're memories you've walked since your earliest steps. In a circular village. Everything had place and everyone had place. The very design resisted anonymity. There was no getting lost, no disappearing into a back alley. A person's position in the circle often corresponded to their role in the group. Skilled elders might live closest to the entrance, ready to greet strangers or sound warnings. Young couples might occupy homes closer to the cooking center, where help was nearby. And those who had passed, they too had place, sometimes buried just beyond the ring, or memorialized in patterns on walls, in beads, in burnt offerings. In this way, the circle was more than architecture. It was social memory, a layout that taught you who mattered, when to speak, whom to turn to. You could walk the ring and name every stone, every groove in the dirt. It wasn't just home. It was a world scaled to human measure. Importantly, circular living instilled a deep sense of belonging by presence. You belonged because you were seen, known, and situated within a geometry that never broke. You were literally part of the circle. And to break that circle, to leave it, betray it, or forget it, was not just physical exile. It was spiritual dislocation. Let's go deeper. Anthropologists studying the remnants of circular villages from sub-Saharan Africa to pre-Columbian North America have noted an astonishing detail. The center of the village almost always had symbolic importance far beyond its practical use. Whether it housed a fire, a stone totem, a sacred tree, or nothing at all, it was regarded as the heart of the community. In some cultures, people were forbidden to walk across it directly. You circled it, respected it, treated it as the navel of the earth. This wasn't superstition, it was spatial reverence. The center was where stories were told, where verdicts were passed, where ancestors were invoked. It was the gathering space for weddings, mourning songs, and shared meals. To stand in the center was to feel the gravity of every gaze, every household looking inward. You stood not just at the center of space, but the center of history, the shape itself closed, smooth, endless, mirrored natural patterns. The moon, the sun, the cycles of seasons, even the human eye all circular. To live within that shape felt like participating in the order of the cosmos. Linear designs might have been easier for trade or expansion, but circles held a different power. They pulled you in, kept you close, reminded you that you were never far from others. Even the act of walking the perimeter had symbolic power. Daily routines created grooves in the dirt, invisible circuits of repetition. Over time, those grooves became like rings in a tree, a mark of age, of endurance, of rhythm. Children could be seen tracing these rings with sticks, inventing games, mimicking the paths their elders walked with purpose. In doing so, they weren't just playing, they were learning their place. There's something else that circles do. They resist hierarchy, unlike towers or ziggurats that elevate one person. Above others, circular villages tend to flatten authority. Everyone sees each other. There's no corner to hide power in. Leadership becomes relational, not vertical. Elders command respect not from isolation, but from interaction. Decisions are discussed in a circle, often literally, where no single voice can dominate for long. It's a layout that whispers, "We are together. We share this space equally." Now, this doesn't mean all was harmonious. Conflict still existed, of course. But when disputes arose, the geometry itself demanded resolution. You couldn't avoid a neighbor in a circle. There was no cul-de-sac to retreat into. That tension forced conversation, confrontation, and eventually resolution. Living in a circle meant learning to live with others, again and again. Think about how different that is from today. Modern urban planning isolates us. Long corridors of apartments, gated communities, detached homes. We've traded collective rhythm for individual convenience. You can live 10 years in a building and never know your neighbor's name. But in a circular village, that was impossible. Let's explore memory again. When someone died, the circle closed around their absence. It didn't collapse, but it registered the loss. People would adjust. Doors might be repainted. Children would ask questions. And over time, stories filled the empty space. The person became a part of the living, ring in a different way. Their memory was carried not just in words, but in layout. You remembered them because their door was once there, because they once sang there, because the way the sunlight hit a certain wall reminded you of how they stood. Dot in this way, space and story were inseparable. Ancient people didn't write memoirs or build museums. Their lives were recorded in the arrangement of space and the patterns of shared movement. And the circular village, with its rhythm of steps and sights, became a living book read daily, not with eyes, but with bodies. You lived the story by walking it. The circle also taught interdependence. You couldn't hoard light, sound, or protection. You shared it. Fires fed warmth outward. Songs echoed in shared air. Even the simple act of cooking sent signals. Someone is making stew. Someone is home. And if the smell stopped, if smoke didn't rise, you noticed, you asked, you cared. That's the kind of social fabric the circle wove. There's a reason. So many ancient communities chose it, even when it wasn't the most practical for trade or farming. It wasn't about efficiency, it was about intimacy, the kind that holds people close. The kind that remembers birthdays without calendars, that knows grief before words, that senses danger by silence. To live in a circular village was to be held not just by walls, but by witnessing. And in a world without phones, maps, or locks, that kind of being seen was not a burden. It was the first and most enduring form of safety. So next time you see the ruins of an old ring of stones, or a diagram of an ancient tribal settlement arranged in a perfect loop, don't just see architecture. See memory, see rhythm, see home. At first glance, a circular village may seem charming, perhaps even symbolic, but there was another, more practical reason behind its enduring design: defense. Long before modern fortifications or organized military strategies, the very shape of a village often served as its first line of protection. Let's go back in time and imagine the realities of daily life. You're part of a small settlement surrounded by forests, plains, or desert. Wildlife prowls beyond your cultivated borders. Rival tribes may pass near or even threaten your survival. There are no police, no surveillance cameras, no high-tech warning systems. In such an unpredictable world, architecture became armor, and the circle was a shield. Circular villages offered 360-degree visibility. No angle was left unseen. Every home was part of a collective watchtower. Inhabitants could spot threats approaching from any direction and communicate quickly through a chain of sight and sound. In this way, the entire perimeter became an early warning system. But the circle did more than just offer sight lines. It created a shared wall of vigilance. Many ancient circular villages featured outer walls formed directly by the rear of each home. Each dwelling reinforced the next, resulting in a unified perimeter. There were no backyards or isolated buildings to serve as weak points. Everything and everyone formed a barrier, solid, mutual, and alert. This architectural interlinking wasn't accidental. It reflected a worldview in which security wasn't delegated, it was shared. If your neighbor's wall collapsed, it left you exposed. If a fire broke out in their kitchen, your roof could catch flames too. This bred a profound culture of mutual accountability, where watching out for others wasn't charity, it was survival. Entrances were few, often limited to a single narrow gate. This choke point was easier to guard and harder to breach. At night it could be barricaded or obscured entirely, making infiltration far more difficult. The circular shape meant any invader would find themselves funneled, surrounded, and disoriented almost immediately upon entry. Some ancient circular villages even included false paths, or intentionally confusing layouts designed to trap unfamiliar outsiders. With no linear streets or predictable corners, invaders had difficulty navigating. In contrast, residents, familiar with every curve and shadow, could maneuver quickly sometimes, launching coordinated defenses or ambushes within the very structure of their home dot. Then there's the psychological effect. Circular designs send a clear signal to outsiders. We are united. There's no broken line, no lonely hut beyond the main structure. That visual unity alone could dissuade would-be attackers. A village that stands in a circle announces itself as a community of equals, tightly woven and tightly aware far more, intimidating than a scattering of isolated homes. Additionally, resource storage and livestock placement were often considered in the circular design. In many traditional societies, animals, goats, chickens, or even larger livestock were kept inside the central space of the ring. This created a natural corral, protected from predators and thieves by the surrounding ring of houses. The people, animals, and supplies were mutually protected at the center of everything. This structure also created a containment effect during crisis. In the event of flood, fire, or conflict, the circle gave a clear boundary within which people could act. The instinct to circle the wagons in later centuries likely has roots in this ancient concept. That defense begins with unity, and unity begins with structure. But the defensive nature of circles wasn't just about battle. It extended to disease. In some communities, the circular arrangement allowed for better control during outbreaks of illness. Inhabitants could isolate sick individuals in outer sectors while ensuring the center remained untouched. Paths for food, water, and communication were carefully routed through the arc of homes, and social practices naturally developed that used the physical layout as a means of quarantine. Before germ theory existed, spatial logic often stepped in to fill the gap in this way. The circle acted as both shield and sieve, keeping danger out, and when necessary, containing it within. And while we often imagine ancient communities as chaotic or unstructured, the very existence of circular planning reveals something deeper. These people were thinking, adapting, surviving. The circle wasn't just a shape. It was a statement, a refusal to be vulnerable, a decision to live in formation rather than fear. There is a wordless power in such a layout. Even now, when archaeologists uncover circular foundations in dry soil or overgrown fields, they often find signs of coordinated defense. Burnt gate posts, defensive ditches, sharpened stakes facing outward. All of it confirms what the shape already tells us, that this was not a scattered group of huts, but a cohesive, conscious effort to endure. So next time you trace a circle in the sand, or pass by the symmetrical ruins of an old community, remember this: behind that graceful geometry lies centuries of instinct, innovation, and communal resilience. In the fight to survive, humans didn't always build higher, they built closer. And the circle was the line they drew to say, "This is ours. We protect it, together." At first glance, a village's shape might seem like a matter of convenience, built to match the terrain, the climate, or simply tradition. But in circular settlements, the very design reshaped the way people lived, thought, and interacted. The circle didn't just protect, it connected. And this connection became the foundation of some of the most enduring aspects of human society: cooperation, communication, and shared identity. Let's imagine living in such a place. Every morning, you'd step out of your home and immediately be facing your entire community. There's no back alley, no private driveway, no hidden corner. Whether you're fetching water, tending to the livestock in the center, or just stretching under the sun, you're in view. This created a constant, subtle sense of mutual awareness. People became highly attuned to each other's rhythms: who was awake, who was missing, who was troubled or celebrating. But this wasn't just about surveillance or nosiness. It built an invisible fabric of familiarity and interdependence. A child crying in one household would echo softly into another. The scent of baking bread might signal a good harvest. Shared joy and hardship were literally built into the architecture. The design of the village didn't allow for isolation. There were no fences, no blocks of separation. If conflict arose, it had to be addressed, because the circle always brought people face to face, and in doing so it encouraged diplomacy over distance. Disputes weren't hidden. They were witnessed, discussed, and often resolved in public. The structure itself was a kind of social contract. If you live here, you live. With us, this communal arrangement also extended to labor and resources. In circular villages, tasks like tending the central livestock, maintaining the shared well, or repairing the boundary dwellings were collective responsibilities. Everyone saw the same problems, and often everyone pitched in to fix them. After all, if one section of the circle weakened, it compromised the entire community. Interestingly, this had long-term cultural effects. Oral histories, traditions, and customs were passed more fluidly in such a close-knit space. Storytelling happened around the communal fire in the center. Children learned by watching their elders work right outside their homes. Celebrations naturally spread through the circle without needing invitation. Cards or banners, the energy moved like sound in a drum, circular and resonant. And then there's status or the surprising lack of it dot in many ancient circular villages. Every home was roughly the same size. The entrance doors all faced inward. No one had a better view or more space. This eliminated the sort of social stratification that would become common in hierarchical urban layouts. There were no high towers or corner estates. Instead, status was earned through behavior and contribution, not architecture. The circle leveled not just the land, but the egos. This design also nurtured empathy. You saw your neighbor's pain, you heard their laughter, you witnessed their rituals, griefs, and joys as if they were part of your own. Over time, this exposure fostered a kind of emotional fluency, an ability to read people deeply and respond with understanding. In many ways, these circular spaces were ancient empathy engines, producing generations of emotionally literate individuals. Of course, such intimacy had its downsides. Privacy was limited. Conflicts, when they did arise, had nowhere to hide. Rumors could travel around the ring as fast as footsteps. But even these challenges forced social evolution. People learned to self-regulate, to practice patience, to communicate clearly because the circle had no corners to escape into. Beyond that, the circle naturally became a calendar of human movement. People could note how early someone rose, how late they worked, how often they were visited. These observations became the quiet background music of communal life, a song sung without words, telling each resident where they stood in the rhythm of the whole. And let's not forget the symbolic weight of the circle itself. Many ancient cultures associated the circle with eternity, unity, and balance. By living within one, people weren't just choosing a structure, they were embracing a worldview. Life was not linear, not divided. It moved in cycles, day to night, season to season, birth to death, and back again. The village itself became a living metaphor, reinforcing the natural flow of existence. So when we ask why people built circular villages, we might be asking the wrong question. Maybe they weren't building a village, they were designing a way of life, one where no one was left behind, where everything and everyone had their place, where the walls weren't just made of wood or stone, but of attention, accountability, and care. In a modern world dominated by walls, fences, and individual driveways, it's easy to forget the simple genius of the circle. It's not just geometry, it's a philosophy. And for those who lived within it, the circle didn't just protect the body, it shaped the soul. When you step back and look at a circular village from above, it almost feels like it belongs to the land. Not just on it, but with it. The rounded shape, The way homes curve with the terrain, the central space breathing like a heartbeat, it all seems natural. And that's no accident. Ancient people were not just skilled builders. They were keen observers of nature. They watched how birds nested, how animals gathered, how rivers curved, how trees spiraled. They paid attention to how the wind moved where the sun rose and set, and how the seasons shifted light and shadow across the earth. They didn't build in opposition to nature, they built with it. And the circle was one of nature's favorite forms. Let's begin with wind, and open plains, or semi-arid regions. Harsh winds could erode buildings, carry dust into living spaces, and make daily life miserable. The circular structure, with homes wrapped around a central core, minimized wind penetration. Rather than allowing the wind to shoot straight through long corridors or rectangular alleys, the circular design deflected and softened. The air would move around the village rather than through it. This made it easier to keep fires burning, dust out of food, and warmth inside. Then there's temperature regulation. Circular designs are inherently more energy efficient. With fewer sharp edges and corners, there are fewer points for heat to escape or enter. In winter, the compact circle helps conserve warmth. In summer, it allows for better shade distribution. The homes positioned in a ring acted like thermal buffers for each other. The collective helps the individual, not just socially, but physically. Your neighbor's house helped insulate your own. Now consider sunlight. In many regions. Circular villages were oriented in such a way that all homes received roughly equal sunlight exposure throughout the day. This wasn't just a convenience. It was survival. Equal light meant equal opportunity to grow herbs, dry food, tan leather, or carry out daily chores. It also meant equal warmth, especially important in colder climates, where morning sun could help melt frost or dry clothing. But perhaps one of the most ingenious ecological advantages was in water management. In areas prone to rain, flooding, or snowmelt, water runoff could easily erode poorly placed settlements. The circular village often included a slight inward or outward slope, depending on the environment, to control water flow. In some designs, the center would be raised to keep water out. In others, it would act as a basin to collect water for communal use. Ditches or stone-lined trenches were subtly integrated into the layout to guide water away from homes while minimizing erosion. Over time, these systems became refined through experience, observation, and generational wisdom. The central space in a circular village wasn't just social, it was functional. It often became a place where natural elements were harnessed. A place for drying grain under the sun, gathering rainfall in communal jars, or planting herbs and small trees that benefited from collective care. The central zone stayed open to the sky, allowing for weather monitoring, seasonal rituals, or simply watching the stars. In a sense, it was the village's eye to the heavens. Animals, too, were considered. In agrarian communities, livestock was often housed in the center of the village. This provided a buffer from predators and thieves, but also created a natural heating system. Animals give off warmth, and at night, in colder seasons, that warmth could help stabilize the ambient temperature of nearby homes. Dung could be collected and dried for fuel. Even the sounds and rhythms of animals became part of the community's auditory ecosystem, like a natural clock reminding people of daily cycles. The materials used in construction were also influenced by the shape. Circular huts or dwellings required fewer support beams to maintain stability. The stress was distributed evenly across the curve, making the structures more resilient to earthquakes or shifting foundations. In regions with limited resources, this meant more efficient use of timber, clay, stone, or grass. Nothing was wasted. Every decision had to consider sustainability, because waste wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. Another fascinating element is fire safety. In rectangular villages with straight lines and narrow paths, fire could race unchecked from one home to another. In circular settlements with space between structures, natural breaks, and sometimes fireproof central zones, such as dirt or stone-paved gathering areas, flames had fewer routes to spread. Villagers also positioned communal ovens or kilns in the center, keeping open flames away from densely thatched rooftops. Let's not forget defense from wildlife. Many early human settlements coexisted with predators, wolves, bears, snakes, and more. A circular layout meant no dark alleyways or hidden corners for creatures to sneak in. The perimeter dwellings acted as a wall, forming a protective ring that discouraged entry. Torches, noise, and the tight formation created a psychological and physical barrier. Inside the ring, children could play and elders could rest without constant fear of sudden attack. What's especially notable is how this structure grew with the community. As populations increased, new homes were simply added around the ring, expanding the circle like ripples in a pond. This allowed for organic growth without disrupting the original logic. Paths remained open, the central space remained accessible, and each family retained its position in the communal orbit. Unlike grid-based cities that required tearing down and rebuilding, the circle adapted. It was a living structure, not a fixed blueprint. Even waste management played a role. With the central area kept clean and open. Waste, whether animal or human, was disposed of outside the ring, often in ponds, mounds, or burial pits located downwind. This not only preserved hygiene, but also encouraged a conscious relationship with one's environment. Nothing was mindlessly discarded. People knew where their waste went, how it broke down, and what it could be used for. In a world without sewers or garbage trucks, this knowledge was vital. Ultimately, the circular village was a natural expression of harmony. Harmony with climate, with terrain, with seasons, and most importantly, with each other. Every stone, every wall, every corner, or lack thereof, told a story about humans learning to live with the earth rather than above it. In modern urban design, we often prioritize individuality, separation, and control. But the ancients, through these simple yet profound circles, prioritized connection, observation, and balance. They weren't just building homes, they were creating a dialogue with the planet, one that echoes quietly even now. Imagine waking up in a circular village. There is no front or back of the community. No single house stands taller or grander than the others. Every home curves around the same shared center. The layout silently whispers, "We are all part of this." This wasn't a coincidence. Ancient people were deeply intentional. They didn't just stumble into circular village design, they chose it because it reflected their social values. At the heart of the circle wasn't just space, it was symbolism. And in this segment, we explore how this structure shaped and was shaped by the social dynamics of its people. Egalitarianism by design circular settlements discouraged hierarchy. Unlike grid-based towns with central plazas dominated by temples, castles, or mansions, the circular layout kept everyone close to the same center. Every home had equal access to communal resources, central fire pits, water storage, and gathering areas. There were no best addresses. Your status wasn't determined by how far you lived from the heart of the village. Everyone was part of the same pulse. Of course, leadership existed. Elders, chiefs, or shamans often held influence. But even their homes were positioned within the same ring. Leadership was rooted in wisdom and trust, not walls and elevation. The circle ensured visibility, both literal and metaphorical. Everyone could see each other. No secrets behind alleyways. No power hidden in private courtyards. This transparency helped communities build accountability and foster trust. Daily life within the ring. Let's walk through a typical day in such a village. At dawn, the central fire would be rekindled. Children might run around the open space, feeding animals, fetching water from a nearby spring or central well. Women would set out herbs to dry or begin preparing grain. Men, depending on the season, might gather tools for hunting, tending to fields, or repairing huts. The central area was alive, not just with activity, but with meaning. It was a place of stories, negotiations, lessons, and ceremonies. Young ones learned to track stars there. Elders recalled myths passed down through generations. Visitors were greeted in the center. Conflicts were settled there too. The very structure of the village invited community interaction. Because everything was visible, behavior was naturally moderated. If someone shirked duties or caused harm, the social gaze was impossible to escape. In a world without prisons or police, the village itself was the conscience. Family and kinship networks, each household along the ring, usually represented a nuclear or extended family. But rather than isolating from one another, these homes flowed into each other. In some designs, walls were shared. In others, yards overlapped. Children wandered freely from one hearth to the next. Grandparents from one house might help raise kids from another. The entire ring functioned as a single breathing organism. When a young couple married, They often built their new home by extending the outer circle, keeping the family unit intact while allowing space for growth. This fluid design supported generational continuity and respected ancestral bonds. In some communities, inner rings housed elder family members, while outer rings were built by the younger generation. This created a spatial rhythm to aging. As one grew older, one moved inward, toward the center, both literally and spiritually. Festivals and rituals. The circle as theater in many ancient societies. Life was punctuated by seasonal rituals, solstices, harvests, births, deaths. The circular village became a natural amphitheater for these moments. During the winter solstice, villagers might gather to light torches and sing songs around a great central fire. During planting season, seeds might be blessed communally before being sown in surrounding fields. The circle allowed everyone to participate equally. There were no front rows. Every face was visible. Every voice was heard. This had a profound psychological effect. In linear spaces, power often flows one way, from a stage or pulpit to passive listeners. In a circle, everyone is part of the story. Participation is not optional, it's inherent. This model encouraged shared responsibility. For both joy and grief. Security and mutual aid. Life in the ancient world was harsh. Illness, injury, drought, and predators were constant threats. But in a circular village, no one faced them alone. If a roof was damaged in a storm, neighbors noticed and helped. If a hunter didn't return, the absence was immediately felt. If an elder fell ill, care arrived from every direction. This wasn't charity, it was survival. The circular layout made mutual aid inevitable. Everyone's well-being was interconnected, literally and spatially. Even food storage followed this principle. While families had individual reserves, many communities maintained communal granaries or smokehouses near the center. During famine or war, this allowed for fair distribution and planning. No one starved in silence, and no one feasted alone. Education. Through observation, one of the most understated advantages of the circle was learning. Children grew up watching every trade and craft in action, from weaving and pottery to tool-making and healing. Skills were learned not in classrooms, but in the open rhythm of daily life. The circular design acted as an educational theater. Curiosity had no walls to block it. Knowledge flowed from hut to hut like smoke through the morning air. Elders didn't have to summon youth to teach. They taught simply by being seen. And because homes weren't isolated, wisdom was never hoarded. A child's apprenticeship began with watching the village. Function. Dispute resolution and justice disputes are inevitable in any society. But circular villages had an advantage. There was nowhere to hide. If tensions arose between neighbors, they couldn't simply retreat behind fences. Conflict had to be addressed, usually in the central space, witnessed by peers and elders. This visibility acted as a social regulator. Justice wasn't institutionalized, it was communal. Elders might mediate, but everyone had a stake in harmony. Forgiveness, restitution, and public accountability mattered more than punishment. The goal wasn't to isolate wrongdoers, but to restore the circle's balance, a village without outsiders. Interestingly, circular villages also raised questions about who was in and who was out. The ring created a defined boundary. Outsiders couldn't enter unnoticed. Visitors were welcomed cautiously, sometimes ritually. The threshold between the outside world and the inner circle was psychologically powerful. But this didn't always mean xenophobia. Some communities used the outer perimeter to host travelers or temporary guests. Others had small break-off circles for newcomers who proved trustworthy. The important thing was that entry required intention and respect. The circle protected what it nurtured. Cycles within circles, perhaps most beautifully. The structure of the circular village mirrored the cycles of life. Birth, maturity, aging, death, sunrise to sunset, planting to harvest. Circles were not just aesthetic, they were philosophical. They reminded people that nothing is linear. Everything comes back around. And living in that shape encouraged patience, observation, and humility. Modern life often feels fragmented. We commute from box-shaped homes to box-shaped offices, stare at rectangular screens, eat from squared packages. We prize efficiency and speed, but something was lost when we left the circle. The ancients, in their wisdom, built in shapes that spoke to the soul. Their circular villages weren't perfect, but they reflected a truth we've nearly forgotten. Human beings are not meant to live apart, but together, facing each other, not away. Imagine standing on a hill at sunrise, gazing down at a small settlement below. From above, the rooftops form a near-perfect ring, each hut angled slightly to face inward, while a soft path surrounds the circle like a protective belt. But this wasn't just a beautiful accident. The villagers didn't build in circles simply out of tradition or symbolism. No, they were reacting to the land, the wind, the water, and the wild. Ancient people understood something modern city planners often forget. Nature always has the final say. Shelter from the storm circular, structures offered natural protection from harsh weather conditions. When placed strategically, say, on a gentle slope or plateau, the round formation broke the wind's momentum. Strong gusts would hit the outer huts, but flow around the circle instead of through it. This protected the center, where fires, food stores, and community gatherings took place. In places where cold was a constant threat. The circular form helped conserve heat. The central fire would warm not just one dwelling, but radiate outward. With homes tightly grouped and curved walls minimizing heat loss, even primitive insulation could make winters survivable. Likewise, in hot and dry climates, circular layouts allowed for maximum shade distribution during midday hours. Small changes in roof angles or orientation could regulate interior temperatures far better than random layout patterns. Water collection and drainage. One of the cleverest benefits of the circular layout came with water management. In many ancient Villages' roofs were slightly slanted inward toward the center. Rainwater could be channeled via troughs into communal basins or underground cisterns. This was especially useful in arid regions where every drop mattered. By pooling resources literally and figuratively, villagers ensured that no single home hoarded water in wetter climates. Circular villages were often elevated slightly at the edges, allowing rain to drain outward along the ring road. This prevented flooding and kept central spaces dry enough for storage, gatherings, and rituals. It also meant fewer disease-carrying mosquitoes, which often breed in stagnant puddles, a fact not lost on communities with generations of accumulated observational knowledge. Defense and design now. Let's talk about danger, not from nature, but from people. Circular settlements were naturally defensive. They could be easily enclosed by wooden palisades, thorny hedges, or stone walls. The circular shape had no vulnerable corners. Attackers couldn't easily breach a single side because every side was connected to every other. Defenders had 360-degree visibility and could respond to threats from any direction quickly. Moreover, the inward-facing design created a psychological boundary. Outsiders entering the central space were immediately visible to all. There were no dark alleyways or isolated corners to hide in. This made stealth attacks or infiltration significantly harder. In essence, the circle was both a watchtower and a womb, defensive yet nurturing. The forest edge, resource efficiency most circular. Villages were built near the edge of forests, not deep inside them nor far away. This allowed for sustainable harvesting of wood, herbs, and wild food without exhausting resources. A ring layout made it easy to rotate pressure on surrounding nature. One year, a group might gather firewood from the northern woods. The next, from the southern side, letting previous zones regenerate. This ecological rhythm mirrored the circular time so prevalent in ancient worldviews. Seasons, moon phases, planting cycles. The very shape of their homes was a living calendar, reminding people to take only what they needed and to always give time for the earth to heal. Animal protection and grazing. Domesticated animals, goats, sheep, chickens, were essential. Circular villages made caring for them easier. In many cases, livestock were kept in the center of the ring at night, where they were safest from predators. The surrounding homes formed a protective barrier, and the animals' presence added warmth to the central space. It also kept them within sight, reducing theft or wandering. In daytime, animals could be released outward to graze in rotational patterns around the village. This decentralized pressure on land and reduced overgrazing. Paths often radiated, like spokes from the circle, allowing herders to efficiently guide flocks in various directions, always returning to the reliable center. Earthquakes, fires, and natural disasters in regions prone to earthquakes, circular structures provided a kind of shock distribution. Round walls with low roofs were less likely to collapse during tremors, compared to tall, rectangular buildings. There were fewer corners to crack, and vibrations flowed more evenly through the structure. Similarly, in case of fire, the circular plan offered both containment and escape routes. Villagers knew exactly how to navigate either inward for help or outward for safety, with minimal confusion. The central space acted as both a rallying point and a firebreak, often surrounded by packed earth, stone, or even fire-resistant vegetation. Harmony with the skies. Lastly, the layout often reflected astronomical understanding. Entrances might align with the rising sun during solstices. Fire pits in the center could mark shadows that tracked seasons. Some villages were oriented so that moonlight flooded the center only during specific months, signaling time to plant, to harvest, or to celebrate. This spatial awareness wasn't superstition, it was survival. Knowing when to sow or store, when to prepare for floods or frosts, often meant the difference between life and starvation. The shape of the village made this knowledge visible and shareable. Even the illiterate could read the sky if the earth was arranged to reflect it. So when we think of ancient villages, simple, earthy, perhaps crude, it's easy to underestimate them. But in truth, these people were engineers of survival, architects of harmony, and guardians of ecological wisdom. Their circular homes weren't quaint or primitive. They were profoundly intelligent, shaped not just by stone and mud, but by generations of observation, respect for the land, and understanding of how life truly works, not in straight lines, but in cycles. When you picture a village built in a circle, it's easy to think only in physical terms: defense, weather protection, community structure. But in this segment, let's go beyond the stones and wood. Let's talk about the cultural memory that grew out of this design. The circular village was not just where people lived, it shaped how they thought, how they passed down stories, and how they understood their place in the world. The circle as a symbol of belonging for generations. People born into circular villages would grow up with a deep, subconscious sense of connection. From the earliest days of childhood, everything important happened at the center of the circle: meals, festivals, weddings, funerals. The central fire, the open space, the gathering point, it was the heart of the village, and every life moment pulsed from or returned to it. This layout was more than a structure. It was a way to teach identity and belonging. No one lived on the edge. There was no concept of a front or back street. Every home faced inward and every person could feel seen. Social isolation was almost structurally impossible. The layout ensured that no one was left out, physically or emotionally. People didn't have to be reminded to care for each other. The layout made care unavoidable. Oral traditions rooted in geometry and oral cultures where stories were not written but told. Memory had to be sharp, and so did structure. Interestingly, many myths, legends, and folk tales from circular village communities follow circular narrative structures themselves. They begin with a journey, pass through trials, and always return home, often changed but always completing the cycle. Even ceremonies mirrored this. Dances took place in circles. Songs were sung in repeating cycles. Seasonal festivals followed the rotation of the year, itself circular. The people weren't just living in a circle. They were thinking in circles, speaking in circles, and passing on ideas through circular rhythms. This shaped entire worldviews. Life wasn't a straight line toward an end. It was a wheel, always turning, always bringing lessons back to where they began, teaching the next generation without words. In these villages, children didn't learn from lectures. They watched and absorbed, and the circular design taught constantly. A child could stand in the center of the village and see every adult role in action. The blacksmith, the weaver, the healer, the elder, all visible from the central path. There were no closed doors or private workshops tucked away behind alleys. Learning was visual, communal, and constant. And when stories were told at night, usually around the fire in the center, they often referenced things the child had seen that day. You remember how Marta helped patch the roof today? Well, long ago, our ancestors, the village itself was the classroom, and its design made every lesson both visible and memorable. Preservation of history through space, because oral tradition is fragile. It can fade with time or misremembering. Communities developed ways to anchor their stories in place. The village layout itself became a kind of living archive. A tree at the center might be known as the place where a great hero once made peace with a rival clan. A certain hut, always kept in the same family, might house the object from a legend. Pathways were named not by letters or numbers, but by events. The path of first snow, the fire line, the drumway. In this way, stories could not be lost. As long as the village stood in its shape, its stories remained intact, passed not just in words, but in geography, the circle, and social equality. Another underappreciated feature of Circular Village. Design was its subtle enforcement of social equality. Unlike hierarchical cities where the wealthy live in elevated houses or central towers, the Circular Village design often had equal-sized homes, evenly spaced, all facing the same direction. Even when some people had greater skill, wisdom, or age, their homes didn't loom over others. This reduced visible status distinctions and helped preserve cohesion and mutual respect. Power, when it was held, was usually carried by elders or councils who gathered at the center rather than sitting on literal thrones. The circle made sure no one could rise too far above or fall too far below. A physical architecture of humility. When the circle was broken, it's telling that when disasters struck, whether war, fire, or famine, the breaking of the circle was often described not just as destruction, but as deep trauma. To lose a home on the edge of a linear street is tragic. To lose a part of a circle is like losing part of a body dot in archaeological sites. When we find only fragments of a circular village, there's a strange sadness. The symmetry is gone, the flow disrupted. And we can imagine how those villagers must have felt disoriented, not just in space, but in memory. Some displaced people even tried to rebuild elsewhere, always in a circle again, as if that shape were a psychological compass, the only way to feel rooted once more. A shape that taught compassion in modern societies. We often think of empathy as a trait you must be taught. But in many ancient circular communities, empathy was woven into the walls. If someone cried in the night, the entire village heard them. If a child wandered out of place, 5 homes saw them. If someone cooked food, the smell traveled inward and made neighbors hungry and likely invited. The circle created not just awareness, but responsibility. You could not pretend not to see, hear, or know. The village shape insisted that everyone was in this together, not as a slogan, but as a structural truth. The circle, once the heart of communal living, the blueprint for harmony, defense, and memory, didn't just fade by accident. Its decline was slow, layered, and deeply tied to changes in how humanity viewed land, power, identity, and even time itself. In this segment, we'll explore why humans, despite the many social and practical advantages of circular village design, began to abandon it. And with that shift, something intangible but vital began to slip away. The agricultural revolution changed more than just crops for early humans. Circular villages were ideal, small, communal, and adaptable. But as agriculture evolved, especially after the invention of the plow and intensive field systems, the needs of society began to shift dramatically. Suddenly, land wasn't just a place to live. It became a commodity, a resource, a thing to measure, divide, and own. Linear systems made more sense in this new world. Rectangular fields were easier to plow. Roads began to connect distant farmlands and markets. Instead of a central shared field or forest, each household began to own and work its own plot, pulling them mentally and physically away from the village. Centered where once people gathered in circles, they now stretched out, tied to rows of crops and emerging trade routes. The rise of private property and hierarchies, one of the most revolutionary and, in some ways, destructive concepts to emerge from this period was the idea of private ownership of land. In circular villages, the layout naturally minimized class divisions. Homes were the same size. The central space was shared. But with private property came inequality. Those who owned more land or more productive plots began to accumulate wealth and power. They didn't want to live in equal-sized huts around a communal center. They wanted mansions, estates, boundaries, and distance. This led to the segregation of living spaces. The wealthy moved to hills or high ground. The poor were left in valleys or clustered in makeshift extensions. The circle, once a symbol of togetherness, was now seen as limiting, even primitive. Military architecture and the death of organic shapes as wars between kingdoms, empires, and tribes intensified, architecture took on a more militarized form. Castles, keeps, walled cities, all these required linear, angular designs optimized for defense, surveillance, and control. Circular villages, with their organic flow and communal centers, were difficult to control from a central authority. There were too many shared spaces, too little clear hierarchy. Rulers and military strategists preferred grids, straight walls, and centralized points of power. The circular model didn't scale well for imperial ambitions. As empires grew, circular villages either got absorbed, flattened, or rebuilt into more orderly shapes. Religion and symbolic geometry. Interestingly, as organized religion grew, in influence, new kinds of sacred geometry emerged. Where ancient circular villages had been aligned with nature and seasons. Temples and churches introduced their own symbolic structures, cruciform layouts, rectangular naves, and centralized altars. Many early Christian and Islamic cities, for example, were laid out with cardinal directions in mind, placing religious structures at the center or along key axes. These sacred geometries often replaced the circular centers of older villages. The circle, once a symbol of natural time and community, became associated with folk traditions, pagan beliefs, or outdated rural life. The sacred moved into defined rectangles, and the village center was no longer the beating heart. It was now the domain of priests, kings, or governors. The Industrial Age. The final blow, the Industrial Revolution, dealt the final blow to circular. The village design. With factories, railroads, and urbanization, humanity's priorities changed almost overnight. Cities expanded at breakneck speeds. Housing had to be efficient, stackable, reproducible. Streets needed to be straight for trams. Neighborhoods became grids, and villages became subdivisions. Circular designs simply didn't fit the machines of modern life. A circular village couldn't accommodate a rail line. Delivery routes didn't function efficiently on winding paths. Mass-produced architecture needed standardized plots, not curved ones. In the name of progress. Circular designs were often flattened or erased entirely, not for ideological reasons, but because they were simply deemed inconvenient. Psychological shifts from collective to individual as humanity moved from communal life to individual ambition. The psychology of space changed too. Circular villages created constant interaction. You couldn't walk outside your door without seeing a dozen faces. Privacy was limited, so was anonymity. In the modern age, people began to crave space, walls, fences, and individual yards. Circular villages became a symbol not of comfort, but of confinement, at least in the modern mindset. People now associated progress with straight roads, single-family homes, and the ability to mind your own business. In losing the circle, we gained freedom, but we also lost familiarity. Archaeological evidence of intentional abandonment. What's striking is that in many parts of the world, circular villages were not simply destroyed by outside forces. They were abandoned intentionally. Archaeological digs in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Europe have shown evidence of well-preserved circular foundations that were vacated without fire, war, or disaster. The people simply left. Why? Because they were drawn to markets, roads, town centers that offered opportunity. The circle was no longer the center of life. The crossroads was. What was once a symbol of safety became a symbol of limitation. Attempts to rebuild the circle in modern times, interestingly, some modern architects and sociologists have tried to bring back the circular model. Eco-villages, intentional communities, and indigenous land reclamation efforts often try to recreate the feeling of togetherness that ancient circles offered. Some even build literal circular compounds, designing homes around shared gardens, fire pits, or open forums. The results are often remarkable: increased well-being, reduced loneliness, more community involvement. But these are the exception, not the rule. The world we've built now is dominated by angles, lines, and borders. The circle, simple, ancient, and holistic, now looks out of place in modern suburbia. The circle still lives in memory despite the loss of circular villages. The symbol of the circle has never truly disappeared. Wedding rings, circular tables, campfires, group hugs, roundabouts, all these hold echoes of a deeper memory. A time when to be human meant to live facing each other, not away. The circular village may be gone in form, but in some deep place inside us, in the way we crave connection, eye contact, shared stories, the circle still lives. We don't build them anymore, but we remember. Although ancient circular villages largely vanished from modern landscapes, their influence never truly disappeared. Beneath the concrete grids of modern cities and the rigid lines of suburban sprawl, the spirit of the circle quietly endured, reimagined, reinterpreted, and often hidden in plain sight. Some of the most unexpected places, space colonies, indigenous settlements, festival grounds, eco-villages, and even global architecture competitions, have all drawn inspiration from the primal, holistic nature of circular design. This segment explores how echoes of the ancient circle still live on and subtly guide how we build, gather, and organize ourselves, sometimes without even realizing it. Let's start with the most striking example: space. When designing future settlements on the Moon or Mars, NASA and other space agencies began studying early human habitats for ideas. What did they find? Circular villages, their geometry offering the best efficiency for space conservation, equal access to shared resources, and resilience under pressure. The circle, it turns out, wasn't just a primitive design. It was profoundly intelligent. In conditions where resources are limited, people are isolated, and cooperation is vital, circular layouts once again emerge as the most logical choice. What worked in prehistoric Africa or Neolithic Europe also works for the red dust plains of Mars. In this way, our future may very well look like our deepest past. Indigenous communities around the world never abandoned the circle completely. In parts of the Amazon, the Congo, and even in North America, traditional housing is still arranged in semicircular or circular formations. This isn't an accident. It's rooted in thousands of years of social logic and environmental harmony. The circle offers equality. There is no front or back, no superior corner lot, no private lawn set apart from others. Every home faces inward. Every person is visible. The hearth, the center, belongs to everyone. In societies where community is survival, this is not just ideal, it's essential. And now modern urban planners are beginning to take note. In post-conflict regions of Africa and Southeast Asia, architects working with NGOs have started reviving circular patterns for rebuilding displaced villages. The logic is clear. Circular clusters create a natural sense of shared ownership and reduce social fragmentation. They also minimize walking distance, create safe inner courtyards for children, and strengthen social bonds between families. In Rwanda and Uganda, for instance, entire neighborhoods have been rebuilt using variations of circular and radial layouts, with incredible social results. Reports showed lower crime, improved emotional well-being, and stronger community participation. In Europe, where most villages have been rectangular for centuries, architects and designers have begun revisiting ancient layouts for inspiration. Experimental towns in Scandinavia, the Netherlands, and Germany have incorporated radial and circular blueprints in new housing developments. Often they use modern materials and technology, but arrange homes around communal gardens, shared solar installations, or public gathering areas. The idea isn't to copy ancient designs directly, but to capture their philosophy: connection over separation, openness over hierarchy. Even cities that appear rigidly gridded often carry subtle circular DNA. Paris, for example, is organized around a radiating network of boulevards, all converging toward symbolic central spaces. Washington, D.C., famously designed by Pierre Charles Linfont, combines a grid with star-like circles radiating from key civic centers. These designs influence how citizens psychologically relate to power, community, and direction. In these cities, to walk toward the center is to move toward meaning. Festivals and temporary cities also unknowingly tap into ancient circular logic. Take Burning Man, the temporary city in the Nevada desert. For years it has been organized in a perfect semicircular form, with radial streets leading toward a central gathering space, the Man. Despite its futuristic aesthetics, the layout mirrors early circular settlements almost exactly. The result? A unique social dynamic, where people feel both connected and autonomous, grounded and exploratory. Whether they know it or not, attendees are reliving a version of an ancient village rhythm, complete with shared resources, storytelling, ritual, and renewal. In academic circles, the circular village has also been reborn, this time as a metaphor. Urban theorists now use the circle model to describe inclusive governance, decentralized planning, and peer-based decision-making, where top-down authority creates pyramids and ladders. Horizontal consensus mimics circles, where every voice has equal proximity to the center. Digital platforms, remote workspaces, and creative teams are beginning to experiment with organizational structures inspired by these ideas. Ancient physical designs are now shaping virtual spaces. Eco-villages and intentional communities, especially in North America and Europe, are among the most conscious adopters of circular planning. Many are built entirely around ancient models, with dwellings circling communal kitchens, gardens, or meditation spaces. Residents claim these layouts create a deeper sense of psychological safety, reduced isolation, and spontaneous collaboration. In some cases, disputes are resolved more quickly, simply because people see each other more often. The built environment encourages empathy. The walls don't hide, they invite. But not all echoes of circular design are intentional. Some appear simply because the human brain finds the circle deeply comforting. Studies in environmental psychology show that people are more likely to relax in circular rooms, sit longer at round tables, and perceive round spaces as safer. It's no coincidence that playgrounds, amphitheaters, and sacred spaces often take on round or oval shapes. The body feels it, even when the mind doesn't recognize it. The irony is that modern society, in its pursuit of efficiency and ownership, slowly pushed the circle away, only to now find itself drawn back to its core ideas. As loneliness, mental health issues, and urban alienation rise, planners are beginning to ask, what if we relearned from the past? What if the answer to some of our most pressing social questions doesn't lie in futuristic tech or vertical sprawl, but in the humble, ancient geometry of the circle? As we've seen, the circle isn't just about layout, it's about philosophy. A worldview where everyone is seen, everyone belongs, and no one is placed above or behind. It's about physical closeness, breeding emotional closeness. It's about space creating solidarity, and so. While ancient circular villages may no longer dominate the Earth's surface, their imprint lives on, not in ruins, but in design choices, psychological impulses, and a growing hunger for connection. We may never return fully to circular villages, but we're beginning to remember why we built them in the first place. What if the past was not just a set of ancient stories, but a blueprint for tomorrow? What if the humble circular village, made of mud, sticks, and shared space, held the key to how we might survive the next century? In the age of smart cities, AI, climate change, and increasingly fragmented social structures, the architectural choices we make aren't just about aesthetics or economics. They reflect how we want to live, relate to each other, and survive in a world growing more unstable by the decade. And strangely enough, more and more visionaries, from climate scientists to architects and space engineers, are turning to the circular designs of the past to imagine a more resilient future. Why? Because circles are efficient. In a world where land is scarce, resources are tight, and populations are swelling, the circle maximizes use with minimal waste. The central courtyard model, the classic heart of circular villages, reduces infrastructure strain. Water lines, energy access, and pathways are shorter and easier to maintain. In emergency scenarios, floods, fires, even war, a circular design minimizes exposure and allows faster, more coordinated responses. It is protective by nature. Imagine a city built not of endless rows and lonely streets, but concentric rings of homes, shared gardens, communal kitchens, medical stations, learning centers, all radiating from a core of green or solar-powered infrastructure. This isn't a utopian fantasy. Experimental urban models in Japan, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia are already prototyping such designs. They aren't calling them villages or primitive, they're calling them regenerative settlements. The idea is not just to sustain life, but to heal people and planet alike. The principles of ancient circular villages also find resonance in climate adaptation. As global temperatures rise, regions once thought livable are becoming inhospitable. In many parts of Africa and Asia, heat, drought, and displacement are already displacing millions. In response, humanitarian groups are testing modular, circular housing clusters for temporary settlements, fast to build, scalable, and naturally designed to promote airflow, shade, and social cohesion. These structures borrow directly from prehistoric African compounds and early South Asian village rings. Built with modern biodegradable materials but arranged in ancient patterns, these settlements offer something rectangular tents and boxy prefab units never could: dignity. Even in crisis, the layout encouraged community interaction, shared child care, and mutual support, just as they did thousands of years ago. And then there's the cosmos. As we push into space, every decision becomes life or death efficient. Space is hostile, and any failure in design could cost lives. In designing space habitats, whether lunar bases, Martian colonies, or orbital stations, engineers continually return to the circle, not just for aesthetic reasons, but because the shape is strong, pressure-resistant, and conducive to psychological well-being. NASA and ESA. Simulations often include radial habitat layouts, personal pods facing central shared zones, minimizing isolation and supporting mental health. When months or years pass in total confinement, just like in ancient times, the key to survival may again lie in shared space and equal visibility. Ironically, the further we travel from Earth, the more we seem to need its oldest lessons. Even back here in tech-obsessed metropolises, the appeal of circular design is gaining traction. Remote work, post-pandemic social reevaluation, and skyrocketing housing costs have forced a generation to ask, what are cities for? Are they just warehouses for labor and money, or can they be redesigned for connection? Some developers are proposing 20-minute cities where everything one needs, work, school, healthcare, groceries, is within a short walk or ride. These aren't built as rows and blocks, but as rings, neighborhoods, as living organisms breathing together. The logic echoes prehistoric settlements, where safety, social life, and sustainability revolved around the circle. It's also worth noting the digital world is mirroring this trend. Social networks, once top-down and algorithmically siloed, are seeing a rise in digital villages, intimate circular communities where people share without performative filters. Online co-housing groups, circular economy initiatives, and open source design hubs are all exploring how to use ancient communal logic in virtual spaces. Even VR architects, those designing the cities of the metaverse, are leaning into radial symmetry and circular flow because our brains still respond best to environments where we feel part of a whole rather than alone in a grid. Psychologically, the appeal is deep-rooted. The circle makes us feel centered. We see everyone. We are seen. No one is behind closed walls. When we build around a center, whether it's a fire, a park, or a shared task, we reclaim a rhythm. We may not consciously remember, but still respond to dot. So perhaps the question isn't why were ancient villages built in circles, but why did we ever stop? For a brief period, mostly during industrialization, we moved toward the linear, the stacked, the segregated. Vertical apartments, corporate cubicles, walled-off suburbs, all functionally efficient, but emotionally distant. And now, with epidemic loneliness, political polarization, and environmental collapse, the collective subconscious seems to be reaching back to something round, warm, connected. Ancient circles weren't perfect. They had conflict, inequality, even violence. But they also embodied a kind of design wisdom we're only now beginning to appreciate again. They weren't just about how people lived, but why they lived. Together, in rhythm, in view of each other dot, so as we design the next chapter of human habitation, whether in forests, deserts, orbit, or digital realities, the ancient circle may become our guide once more, not because it's nostalgic, but because it works. And maybe, just maybe, the future isn't a towering spire or endless grid. Maybe it's a warm circle of homes, a shared hearth, and a space where no one is left unseen. When we step into a circular room, something subtle shifts. We may not immediately recognize it, but the body softens, the mind settles. There's a strange comfort in roundness, a sense of unity, protection, even timelessness. But why? What? Is it about circular structures that evoke such deep-seated responses in us? To understand why ancient people instinctively built their homes, villages, and temples in circles, and why we still find ourselves drawn to these spaces today, we must look beyond the physical and architectural. We must look into the neuroscience of shape and the psychological impact of spatial design, modern studies in environmental psychology and neuroarchitecture, a field at the intersection of neuroscience and building design, show that circular environments stimulate the brain in ways that linear or angular spaces do not. When a person enters a circular space, the amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes less active. In contrast, boxy, angular spaces tend to elevate tension and hyper-awareness, especially in unfamiliar settings. This subconscious reaction is tied to evolutionary survival. Jagged edges and corners in the wild often meant danger, rocks, weapons, predators. Roundness, on the other hand, suggested safety, softness, and containment. It's no coincidence that our earliest shelters, from African crawls to Native American teepees to Arctic igloos, were round. Our brains evolved within these spaces. The symmetry and flow of a circle aligns with the way we perceive and process our surroundings. A circular room offers no dead ends, no sharp shadows, no psychological blind spots. In a village built in, a circle, you're always within sight of the center, always part of the whole. This visibility fosters not only security, but belonging. One experiment conducted by architectural psychologists had participants spend time in differently shaped rooms: square, rectangular, L-shaped, and circular. Across multiple tests, people consistently rated circular rooms as more relaxing, harmonious, and even beautiful. Heart rate monitors showed lower levels of stress, and participants reported a greater sense of connectedness, not just to the space, but to others within it. Another interesting factor is acoustic harmony. Circular spaces often diffuse sound more evenly, allowing voices, music, and even silence to carry gently throughout the area. This auditory softness reduces sensory overload. Ancient tribes may not have had acoustic engineers, but their design choices reflect an intuitive grasp of how space affects sound and how sound affects mood. We also must consider the effect of circular layout on social behavior. In social psychology, there's a phenomenon known as equity of attention. The idea that people positioned in a circle receive more equal visual and verbal engagement than those seated in rows or scattered clusters. In other words, circles flatten hierarchies. In a circular village, it's harder to hide, but it's also harder to be ignored that there are no corners to be isolated in. You can't retreat to the edge of the crowd. Everyone faces toward the center, toward the fire, toward the discussion, or toward each other. This may explain why conflict resolution models, both ancient and modern, often involve sitting in a circle. From tribal councils to modern restorative justice circles, the shape communicates one message: we are here together, and every voice matters. This circular arrangement has even been shown to influence decision-making and empathy. Studies indicate that people in round-table discussions are more likely to compromise, to listen actively, and to refrain from dominating the conversation. It's as if the shape itself whispers, cooperate, share, be seen. Now let's step even further into the child's mind. Developmental psychology shows that from infancy, humans show a preference for curved shapes over angular ones. Even babies reach more quickly towards circular or rounded objects. They stare longer at curved faces and calm more readily in round spaces. It's a primal attraction, one that continues into adulthood even if we stop noticing it consciously. This innate preference has led to a resurgence in biophilic design, an architectural approach that mimics natural forms and patterns. And guess what nature prefers? Circles. From the spirals of galaxies to the rings of a tree to the swirl of a seashell, the universe echoes with roundness. Our ancestors knew this. Their villages weren't just practical, they were cosmic, built to mirror the natural patterns all around them. Even in our dreams, circles dominate. Psychologists studying dream imagery find that circular symbols, wheels, spirals, suns, are some of the most universal. Carl Jung considered the mandala, a circular symbol, to be the purest expression of the self. Could it be that the circular village, the shared hearth, the communal ring of dwellings, was humanity's first mandala? This would explain the deep comfort modern people feel when encountering these layouts. It's not nostalgia, it's recognition. At some level, we remember. We know this pattern. We trust it. There's also the physical effect. Circular movement, whether walking in a circle, sitting in one, or living in a radial layout, engages both hemispheres of the brain. It supports integration, helping us process emotion, memory, and cognition more fluidly. It may sound poetic, but the evidence suggests it's real. Circles help us feel whole. Now consider this. Most urban spaces today are built on rigid grids, square buildings, rectangular rooms, straight roads. This format is efficient for mass production, but psychologically, it's unnatural. It subtly reinforces separateness, hierarchy, and fragmentation. We sleep in boxes, work in boxes, move through hallways like packages on conveyor belts. When we're stressed, overwhelmed, disconnected, it may not just be because of technology or work or politics. It may be the shape of our lives. The geometry of isolation. So as we look back at ancient circular villages with their open centers, flowing movement, and shared rhythms, we're not just admiring their practicality. We're remembering a design that speaks directly to our minds and bodies, one that supports who we are, not just what we do. And maybe the future of design in schools, cities, even virtual spaces, won't be just about sustainability or smart grids. It will be about healing, reconnecting, returning to the shape that always made sense, the circle. Though the ancient world has long since faded into ruins and overgrown earth, its circular villages continue to whisper through the spaces we inhabit today, sometimes loudly, sometimes so subtly we don't even notice. The round patterns that once shaped our ancestors' lives haven't vanished. They've simply evolved, embedded deep in our collective memory and quietly influencing our environments, choices, and behaviors. Modern urban landscapes may be defined by grids and straight lines, but there's a quiet revolution stirring in how we design places to live, learn, and connect. Architects, planners, and psychologists are beginning to recognize what ancient builders already knew, that form is not neutral. The shape of our environments deeply affects the shape of our lives. Take urban roundabouts, for instance. While at first glance they appear to be a purely logistical traffic solution, studies show that their circular motion reduces anxiety for drivers, improves flow, and reduces collisions. Meanwhile, circular classrooms are being reintroduced in schools to encourage equality among students. promoting inclusiveness and eye contact, just as circular tribal gatherings once did. In eco-villages and intentional communities, people are returning to circular building layouts, often positioning homes around central gardens, fires, or gathering spaces. These aren't just aesthetic decisions, they're rooted in psychology, sustainability, and a longing for connection. Residents of these communities report lower stress levels, stronger social bonds, and greater satisfaction in their daily routines. Even digital spaces are being affected. Social media groups and online discussion circles, whether consciously or not, evoke the ancient idea of shared space and collective dialogue. Metaphors rooted in circles remain powerful. We say things like closing the circle, full circle, circle of life, or inner circle. The language reflects something deeper, our yearning for completeness and cohesion. There's also a quiet movement in modern therapy and group healing circles. These gatherings, often held in person or virtually, emphasize non-hierarchical dialogue and mutual respect, values that naturally align with the circle as a shape. No head of the table, no back row, just people, eye to eye, heart to heart. Why does this matter? Because in an age of fragmentation, politically, socially, technologically, we are once again searching for ways to recenter ourselves. The circle represents more than shelter or design. It represents wholeness. It teaches us that everyone belongs, that strength comes from unity, and that history doesn't move in a straight line, but rather in cycles. There's a reason the most sacred places of the past, Stonehenge, medicine wheels, tribal huts, were all round. The ancients didn't have blueprints, yet they built in a way that resonated with their lives. Each structure was a reflection of the natural world and of their understanding of community. They didn't need science to explain that circles are efficient, comforting, or harmonizing. They simply felt it, and they trusted it. So while the straight lines of modernity have taken us far into skyscrapers, satellites, and digital frontiers, they may have also taken us away from something fundamentally human. That ancient knowledge, carved into stone, woven into rituals, and reflected in the very layout of homes, reminds you that there's another way to live. Maybe the future isn't just about innovation. Maybe it's about remembering. As we've journeyed through the story of circular villages, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't just a clever layout or a passing architectural trend. It was a deep expression of human need, rooted in safety, cooperation, memory, and the rhythms of the natural world. From the structural strength of the circle to its emotional impact. From spiritual symbolism to social balance, ancient builders understood that the shape of space influences the shape of life. And though we may live in towers and rectangles today, the circle still calls to us quietly, insistently, reminding us of where we came from and what we've lost. In the quiet curve of a circular path, in the ring of chairs at a gathering, in the roundness of a shared meal or a communal fire, we find echoes of those ancient villages. Echoes that remind us that belonging is not just about proximity, but about perspective. that living together means seeing each other, not across, not down a hallway, but around a shared center dot. So perhaps the circle isn't just an old shape dot. It's an invitation, remember, to reconnect and to come home.